The hegemony's tactical computers had evolved beyond the need for actual thinking, which was fortunate since most of their operators had given up the practice centuries ago. These magnificent crystalline constructs could calculate the trajectory of every photon in a solar flare, predict the mating patterns of quantum butterflies, and determine the exact moment when a civilization would discover that yes, the universe really was laughing at them. What they could not do, apparently, was comprehend why humans kept winning battles they had no mathematical right to survive. Admiral Winthe of the Greater Hegemony stared at the holographic display with the sort of expression typically reserved for discovering one's pet had achieved sentience and filed for emancipation. The tactical readout was pristine in its clarity. 47 hegemony vessels arranged in perfect formation, each one a monument to 10,000 years of military engineering. Opposing them, hanging in Earth's orbital space like a collection of particularly aggressive refrigerators, sat 23 human ships that looked as though they had been assembled by committee during a particularly heated disagreement. "The probability matrices are unanimous," announced his tactical officer, a being whose species had evolved past the need for names, settling instead for a series of harmonic frequencies that roughly translated to "the one who points out obvious things." Total victory probability 96.7% in our favor. Enemy survival likelihood 3.3%, with a statistical margin of error that brings their realistic chances to an even 4%. Admiral Winthe's primary thinking appendage twitched with what could generously be called satisfaction. After all, the humans had been a persistent irritation ever since they had discovered that the galaxy operated under a complex set of diplomatic protocols and had responded by completely ignoring them. They treated interstellar law like a suggestion box, military doctrine like a comedy routine, and the fundamental constants of physics like personal challenges. The human fleet's flagship responded to his hail with the sort of casual professionalism that made seasoned military officers break out in nervous sweats. The captain who appeared on screen possessed the distinctly human trait of looking simultaneously bored and ready to commit acts that would violate several laws of physics. Her uniform suggested military discipline. Her expression suggested she had long ago decided that military discipline was more of a guideline than a rule. Captain Admiral Winthe began employing the sort of tone reserved for addressing inferior species who had somehow stumbled into positions they were mathematically unqualified to hold. "I am required by hegemony protocol to offer you the opportunity to surrender before we demonstrate the futility of resistance." The human captain leaned back in her chair with the casual confidence of someone who had clearly missed the memo about proper respect for overwhelming odds. "That's very thoughtful of you, Admiral. What are my chances if I decide to fight instead?" "Our tactical computers have calculated your probability of victory at precisely 4%. Winthe replied, unable to keep a note of smugness from creeping into his voice. After all, these were the same computers that had predicted the rise and fall of 17 civilizations, calculated the precise moment when the Antaran Empire would collapse under the weight of its own bureaucracy, and determined that the probability of anyone actually understanding quantum mechanics was approximately zero. The human captain's response would, in the fullness of time, be studied in military academies across 3 spiral arms, analyzed by xenopsychologists seeking to understand the human condition, and eventually carved into the monument erected to commemorate the day the galaxy learned to fear human mathematics. She smiled. "Only 4%, she said, with the sort of cheerful enthusiasm typically reserved for discovering unexpected inheritance from wealthy relatives. "Well then, I suppose I should ask what you're planning to do with the other 90. The transmission ended with what humans would call a mic drop, though the hegemony's translation computers rendered it as acoustic device deliberately discarded in gesture of dismissive superiority. Admiral Winthe stared at the blank screen, his tactical computers humming with the electronic equivalent of confused muttering. "Sir?" ventured the one who points out obvious things. "Should we begin the attack sequence?" Withe's species had evolved advanced pattern recognition over millions of years. Right now, every instinct he possessed was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this scenario. Unfortunately, his tactical computers disagreed, and tactical computers, unlike instincts, came with warranties and customer support. "Proceed with the assault," he ordered, though his voice carried the tone of someone who suspected he might be about to discover exactly why the universe had developed a sense of humor. "And monitor all human vessels for unusual activity. Below them, Earth's orbital defense platforms powered up with the sort of mechanical precision that suggested someone had been expecting this conversation for quite some time. The Hegemony's War Council convened with the sort of urgency typically reserved for discovering that one's supposedly extinct enemy had not only survived but had also learned to tap dance. Admiral Winthe presided over a gathering of the galaxy's finest military minds, each representing civilizations that had mastered the art of warfare through careful application of mathematics, logic, and an appropriate respect for the laws of physics. Behavioral analysis of the human captains suggests either supreme confidence or complete psychological breakdown, reported Commander Ylandra, whose species had evolved the ability to read micro-expressions across 17 different dimensional planes. Unfortunately, with humans, these two states appear to be functionally identical. The assembled commanders exchanged what could charitably be called concerned glances. They had all studied human military doctrine, insofar as anyone could study something that appeared to have been written by committee during a particularly intense sugar rush. Human tactical manuals read less like strategic guidance and more like collections of increasingly improbable suggestions for annoying one's enemies to death. Review the Epsilon Eridani incident, ordered Winthe, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who had spent considerable time trying to explain human behavior to superior officers. The holographic display flickered to life, showing the aftermath of humanity's first major space battle. According to every tactical computer in the galaxy, the human fleet should have been obliterated within the first 17 minutes. Instead, they had somehow managed to turn a routine space engagement into what military historians would later classify as aggressive interpretive dance performed with starships. The humans began the engagement by ignoring established battle formation protocols, Commander Ylandra continued, her voice taking on the slightly strained quality of someone trying to describe a fever dream to a psychiatrist. They then proceeded to use their medical supply ships as improvised missiles, their cargo vessels as decoy flagships, and their actual flagship as what they termed a distraction. The result being, prompted Winthe, though he already knew the answer, complete victory. Casualty rate, 0. Enemy surrender rate 100%. Our tactical computers required extensive therapy afterward. The War Council absorbed this information with the sort of stunned silence typically associated with discovering that gravity had decided to take a day off. Admiral Winthe's primary consciousness briefly considered the possibility that the universe had developed a drinking problem. Meanwhile, aboard the human flagship, the captain was addressing her crew with the casual air of someone discussing weekend plans rather than imminent annihilation. The bridge hummed with the sort of organized chaos that human military operations seemed to thrive on, a controlled confusion that made alien observers wonder if humans had evolved from a species that had successfully weaponized entropy itself. Ladies, gentlemen, and those of you who have transcended such primitive classifications, the captain announced, her voice carrying across the bridge with the easy confidence of someone who had clearly made peace with the universe's tendency toward cosmic irony. We are about to engage in what our alien friends would call a statistically impossible victory scenario. Her crew responded with the sort of enthusiastic cheering typically reserved for surprise holidays, or the discovery of chocolate reserves. This was, the captain reflected, exactly the sort of response that made other species wonder if humans had collectively agreed to ignore the concept of self-preservation. Our tactical computers have been working overtime, continued her operations officer, a woman whose previous career had involved explaining quantum mechanics to kindergartners. They've calculated exactly 2,847 different ways we should all be dead in the next 43. Asked the weapons officer with the sort of professional disappointment that suggested he had been hoping for a more impressive number. Last month's simulation hit. The captain grinned with the sort of expression that had historically preceded events that would require extensive revision of physics textbooks. Well then, we'll just have to be creative. Navigation. I need you to plot a course that violates at least 3 fundamental laws of motion. Engineering. See if you can convince our engines that momentum is more of a suggestion than a rule. Weapons. I want our torpedo tubes loaded with everything except actual torpedoes. What should we load them with? Asked the weapons officer, already mentally cataloging the ship's inventory for items that had never been designed to serve as projectiles but probably could. Surprise me, the captain replied, but make sure it's something that will require the alien historians to invent entirely new categories of combat engagement. Back aboard the Hegemony flagship, Admiral Winthe was experiencing the peculiar sensation of watching his carefully constructed understanding of military strategy slowly dissolve into cosmic background radiation. His tactical computers were generating probability matrices at an unprecedented rate, each calculation confirming that the humans were about to attempt something that was mathematically, physically, and philosophically inadvisable. "Sir," announced the one who points out obvious things, his harmonic frequencies carrying a note of barely controlled panic. "The human vessels are beginning to move. Their formation appears to be interpretive. Winthe's voice climbed several octaves, a feat that his species had previously believed to be physically impossible. "They appear to be arranging themselves into what our cultural analysis computers identify as either a flower pattern or a deliberate insult in an unknown alien language." Admiral Winthe closed his primary optical sensors and briefly entertained the fantasy that when he opened them again, he would discover this had all been an elaborate stress-induced hallucination. Unfortunately, the universe had never shown him that level of courtesy before, and today seemed unlikely to break that tradition. "Signal the fleet," he ordered, his voice carrying the resigned tone of someone who had just realized that his memoirs were going to require a chapter titled "The Day Physics Called in." "Prepare for engagement with an enemy force that has apparently declared war on the concept of predictable behavior." The human fleet continued its leisurely approach, each vessel moving with the sort of casual disregard for conventional tactics that made military scholars weep into their theoretical models. The opening salvo of what would later be known as the Battle of Statistical Impossibility began precisely at 1432 Galactic Standard Time, when the human flagship opened fire with what appeared to be its entire kitchen inventory. Admiral Winthe watched in mounting horror as his tactical computers attempted to categorize projectiles that included industrial-grade coffee makers, 17 cases of expired ration packs, and what his translation software identified as recreational sporting equipment designed for percussive entertainment. "Sir," reported the one who points out obvious things, his harmonic frequencies now approaching frequencies previously associated with existential crisis. "Their first volley appears to have been non-lethal." This was technically accurate, though it failed to capture the full psychological impact of being pelted with objects that had never been intended for military use. The hegemony's forward battle line found itself dealing with an unprecedented tactical scenario. How does one respond to an enemy whose opening gambit appears to have been designed by someone with access to military hardware and the strategic mindset of a particularly creative child? The human captain's voice crackled across all communication frequencies with the sort of cheerful professionalism that made seasoned military officers question their career choices. "Attention hegemony forces, this is your daily reminder that humans have been finding creative uses for household objects since before we discovered fire. Today's demonstration will focus on applied improvisation in zero-gravity environments." What followed could best be described as a masterclass in weaponizing the unexpected. The human vessels, having apparently concluded that conventional space combat was insufficiently entertaining, began employing tactics that seemed to have been developed by someone who had read every military manual in existence and then decided to use them as rough guidelines rather than actual instruction. The second wave of human attacks consisted of their cargo ships launching what the hegemony's sensors identified as construction equipment. Admiral Winthe watched in fascination and growing dread as industrial mining lasers, normally used for asteroid processing, began carving through his fleet's outer defensive perimeter, with the sort of efficiency that suggested the humans had been planning this particular application for quite some time. "They're using civilian infrastructure as weapons platforms," Commander Yelandra announced, her voice carrying the slightly hysterical edge of someone who had just watched her understanding of military doctrine spontaneously combust. "Their garbage scows are launching refuse at our sensor array. Our targeting computers are being overwhelmed by what appears to be space debris arranged in offensive formation." The tactical display now resembled less a military engagement and more an abstract art installation created by someone with questionable artistic judgment and access to military-grade propulsion systems. Human vessels weaved through the hegemony formation with the sort of casual disregard for established flight patterns that made traffic control officers develop nervous twitches. Admiral Winthe's tactical computers, those pinnacles of strategic calculation that had successfully predicted the outcome of 1,000 battles, began displaying what could only be described as computational anxiety. Probability matrices that had remained stable for millennia suddenly started fluctuating like stock prices during a particularly dramatic economic collapse. Probability assessment update, announced the ship's primary tactical intelligence, its usual confident tone replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like electronic bewilderment. Human victory probability has increased from 4% to recalculating 20th error. Mathematics appears to be malfunctioning. The human fleet's medical ships, which according to all established protocols should have remained safely behind the battle line, had somehow positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the engagement zone and were now functioning as what the humans cheerfully referred to as mobile repair and tactical advisory stations. They were simultaneously healing damaged hegemony vessels and providing running commentary on the battle that was being broadcast across all emergency frequencies. "This is human medical vessel Nightingale offering emergency assistance," came a voice that managed to sound both professionally compassionate and mildly sarcastic. "We're currently treating 17 cases of tactical confusion, 43 instances of strategic disbelief, and 1 case of what appears to be mathematical allergic reaction. Side effects may include questioning fundamental assumptions about military doctrine and an irresistible urge to revise probability textbooks." The hegemony's central command ship found itself surrounded by human vessels that appeared to be engaged in what could only be described as interpretive warfare. They moved with a coordination that suggested extensive planning combined with a complete willingness to abandon that planning the moment something more interesting presented itself. The one who points out obvious things had now achieved harmonic frequencies that registered somewhere between barely controlled panic and philosophical breakthrough. "The humans appear to be executing a tactical maneuver that our computers classify as aggressively illogical but disturbingly effective." "What kind of maneuver?" Admiral Vextani asked, though he was beginning to suspect that asking for clarification was merely prolonging his suffering. "They're using their flagship as a decoy while their actual command ship appears to be the vessel we initially classified as a food service transport. Their weapons platforms are disguised as recreational facilities, and their recreational facilities appear to be launching guided projectiles that our sensors identify as exercise equipment." The human captain's voice returned to the communication channels, now sounding pleasantly conversational despite being in the middle of what was theoretically a life-or-death struggle. "Hegemony Command, you might want to check your 6 o'clock position. We've got a few ships coming up behind you that I think you'll find interesting." Admiral Vextani's tactical display suddenly lit up with new contacts that had somehow approached his fleet's rear formation without triggering a single early warning system. According to his sensors, these were civilian vessels, research ships, exploration craft, and what appeared to be a small fleet of interplanetary tour buses that had somehow been converted into makeshift weapons platforms. Was all Vextani managed to say, his voice carrying the sort of defeated bewilderment typically associated with discovering that one's supposedly foolproof plan had been outsmarted by a species that considered winging it to be a legitimate military strategy. "Oh," the human captain replied with the sort of casual pride that made it clear she had been looking forward to this moment. "We've been preparing for this conversation for about 6 months. Turns out when you give humans enough time to think about a problem, we tend to come up with solutions that weren't covered in anyone's tactical manuals." The hegemony's probability computers finally achieved something that their designers had believed to be impossible. They gave, one by one, the displays showing human defeat probability began flickering and then simply showed insufficient data to calculate meaningful prediction. Admiral Vextani stared at his instruments with the expression of someone who had just watched the universe decide to take a creative writing class. The battle, which should have been decided in the first 20 minutes, had somehow transformed into a demonstration of why the galaxy's military academies were going to need entirely new curriculum. The human fleet continued its impossible dance through space, each maneuver more improbable than the last, while their crews maintained a running commentary that sounded less like military communication and more like sports commentary provided by particularly enthusiastic amateurs who had stumbled into professional warfare by accident. The decisive moment of the battle of statistical impossibility arrived not with the thunderous roar of conventional weapons, but with what would later be classified by military historians as the most aggressively polite surrender request in galactic history. Admiral Vextani found himself staring at a communication screen displaying the human captain's face, which wore the sort of patient expression typically reserved for explaining simple concepts to particularly slow students. "Admiral," she began, her tone carrying the gentle authority of someone who had just finished rearranging the fundamental laws of military engagement. "I believe this would be an excellent time for you to consider your options. Our tactical analysis suggests that continuing this engagement would result in what we humans call unnecessary paperwork." The hegemony fleet hung motionless in space, surrounded by human vessels that had somehow achieved positions that violated several basic principles of three-dimensional movement. Admiral Vekstani's tactical computers had progressed beyond mere electronic confusion and were now displaying what could only be described as digital existential crisis. Error messages scrolled across his screens in languages that his translation software claimed didn't exist. "Sir." The one who points out obvious things had achieved harmonic frequencies that registered somewhere in the realm of cosmic enlightenment. "Our position appears to be mathematically paradoxical." This was, Admiral Vekstani reflected, probably the most accurate military assessment anyone had ever provided. His fleet, which had begun the engagement with overwhelming numerical superiority, tactical advantage and the confident backing of 10,000 years of military doctrine, was now effectively surrounded by an enemy force that had apparently achieved victory through the simple expedient of refusing to acknowledge that they were supposed to lose. The human captain continued with the sort of cheerful professionalism that made it clear she had been enjoying this conversation considerably more than was probably appropriate for a military engagement. "We've taken the liberty of disabling your primary weapon systems, redirecting your communications arrays, and what our engineering team likes to call creatively reinterpreting your navigation computers. Nothing permanent, mind you, but enough to ensure that any attempt to continue hostilities would result in your fleet accidentally spelling out amusing messages in 17 different alien languages." Admiral Vekstani's species had evolved beyond the need for profanity, but at this moment he found himself wishing they had retained the capability. His fleet's weapons systems were indeed offline, though disabled hardly captured the creative thoroughness with which the humans had approached the task. According to his engineering reports, his primary gun batteries had been converted into what the humans had cheerfully labeled emergency broadcasting equipment, while his missile launchers were now apparently capable of launching nothing more threatening than party invitations. He asked, his voice carrying the sort of defeated curiosity that typically preceded major revisions to one's understanding of reality. "Oh, that's the interesting part," the human captain replied, settling back in her chair with the satisfied air of someone about to explain a particularly clever magic trick. "You see, your tactical computers were absolutely correct about our chances of winning a conventional space battle. 4% was actually quite generous considering the circumstances." She paused, apparently savoring the moment with the sort of professional appreciation that great teachers reserve for particularly elegant demonstrations. "The thing is, Admiral, humans stopped fighting conventional battles about the same time we discovered that the universe has a sense of humor. We've spent the last several centuries developing what our military theorists call aggressive creative problem solving, which is a polite way of saying we've weaponized the art of thinking sideways." Admiral Vekstani's tactical display now showed his fleet arranged in what his cultural analysis computers identified as a pattern that simultaneously resembled a flower spelled out an ancient human blessing, and somehow managed to be mildly insulting in 12 different alien languages. This, he was beginning to understand, was probably not a coincidence. "Your computers calculated the probability of defeating us in direct combat," the captain continued, her voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly gifted but confused student. "What they failed to account for was the possibility that we might not be interested in fighting that kind of battle." The implications of this statement settled over the hegemony fleet like a particularly dense fog of cosmic irony. Their overwhelming technological superiority had been rendered irrelevant by an enemy that had simply decided to play by different rules. It was, Admiral Vekstani realized, roughly equivalent to preparing for a chess match only to discover that one's opponent had brought a deck of cards and was now explaining the rules of a game that appeared to involve interpretive dance. The aftermath of the battle of statistical impossibility would reshape galactic military doctrine for the next millennium. Within hours of the hegemony's surrender, every major military academy in 3 spiral arms had begun frantically revising their curriculum to include courses with titles like Applied Human Logic, Tactical Improvisation Theory, and Emergency Probability Adjustment for Impossible Scenario. The human captain's post-battle interview,
conducted by a panel of the galaxy's most distinguished military theorists, became required viewing at institutions of higher learning throughout known space. Her opening statement alone would be quoted in strategy textbooks for generations. The secret to human military success isn't that we're particularly clever or brave, she explained to an audience of beings whose species had mastered interstellar travel, while humans were still discovering fire. It's that we've never quite accepted the universe's insistence that certain things are impossible. We tend to treat physical laws more like strongly worded suggestions. When asked to explain her infamous response to Admiral Vextani's 4% victory assessment, she had smiled with the sort of expression that made military historians reach for their recording equipment. "Well," she said, "when someone tells me I have a 4% chance of success, I figure that means I've got 96% room for improvement. That's not a limitation, that's an opportunity." Humans have a long history of finding creative uses for leftover percentage points. The interviewing panel, composed of representatives from civilizations that had spent millennia perfecting the art of logical military strategy, sat in stunned silence as they contemplated the implications of a species that treated mathematical impossibility as a personal challenge. Admiral Vextani, who had requested to observe the interview from a safe distance, found himself experiencing what his species' philosophers would later classify as enlightened bewilderment. He had entered the battle confident in the supremacy of logic, mathematics, and carefully calculated tactical superiority. He was leaving with the uncomfortable awareness that somewhere in the universe, there existed a species that had looked at the fundamental constants of reality and decided they were more like rough guidelines than actual rules. The galaxy would never quite be the same. Military computers across civilized space began incorporating new variables into their probability calculations, variables with names like human creativity factor and illogical but effective coefficient. The universe, meanwhile, continued its slow rotation through space, occasionally emitting what sensitive instruments detected as faint cosmic chuckling. And somewhere in Earth's orbital space, a human captain finished her shift report and wondered what impossible thing she might have to do tomorrow.